Now recording. If you watch the YouTube channel this semester, I'm also teaching a course in Java programming. So if Java is a language you're interested in picking up, it's going right from like basic bare bones right up all the way through object-oriented programming. A lot of the material, there's some overlap with the material done that we did last semester in fundamentals, but like in a language where it makes sense to study it, if that makes sense. So, you know, if you're just you've got so much time on your hands this semester that you're interested in watching a little extra videos on programming, I recommend my upcoming series on Java. Java is a good language, I like it. But, at any rate, so, last time we were talking about HTML. We did some basic stuff. We saw how we lay out an HTML page. We saw what the difference between the head and the body is. We talked about how to add headings and paragraphs, tables, lists, and we had just kind of slightly gotten into forms. For today, I thought we'd explore forms a little bit further, just to you know, flesh that out a little bit more, because we only really talked about text boxes, and there are a couple of things that we will need to have, a couple of additional attributes that will be necessary once we start integrating JavaScript and even CSS into our HTML. So, but let's start with a review. Let's open up VS Code and make ourselves a brand new web page. By means of, you know, slight apology for not recording the last session. The longer your password is, the more secure it is. Oh, let's see, sorry, the display is like, I don't know who it is. It's always in this room. It just gets the displays wrong. Like, there's really no other correct choice in this case than duplicate display. What is the point of extending? Why is it in that? Who sets it to that? I ask you, who sets it to that? And then doesn't unset it. It's just you'd think that would be the sort of setting that would travel with the user rather than with the machine. All right, so let's get VS Code up and running. Recall that VS Code is the code editor that we are going to be using for our HTML, JavaScript. Basically, actually, we can do the whole damn course in this thing. So, with the possible exception of Laravel, we'll see when we get there. So, I'm going to open a folder rather than creating a file. The step of opening the folder sets some settings inside of VS Code that make things easier, like file discoverability. You know that thing where we could like link to files and open them, that sort of thing? This process helps that. So let's just make a new folder, class 2, inside of documents. Select folder, there we go. Yes, I trust myself. Now, this panel along the side, which you can hide by clicking the Explorer button, this is a view of all of the files inside of that folder. You don't actually have to be flip-flopping between the File Explorer window and VS Code. You have it built in. That's what this is. So we can create a new file, call that file index.html. You'll notice that it automatically discovers what the file type is from the file extension. There we go. Now, there was a particular shortcut combination which inserted a lot of default HTML code for us. Does anybody remember what it was? Looking at his notes.
Shift 1 tab.
Yes. Or exclamation point
Yes.
tab. Very good. Awesome. So you don't have to worry about most of the contents here. The important ones, basically, HTML language equals EN. That's of course the code for English, which is the default. If it happens that you're making a website intended to be read in, or that's written in some language other than English, that is where you would modify that. So the purpose there, you know how certain browsers will offer to automatically translate a page for you when it occurs in a language other than the default language of the browser? This is how it knows which language it's supposed to be translating from. So, for example, if my default language set in my browser is Korean, and this thing indicates that the language of the page is Swahili, right? Then, it offers to fire up Google Translate for you, but that's the input to that process, the language code there. So if you forget to set that, people in other regions of the world who don't speak English will not get that assistance by default. So in some sense, that is an important accessibility concern, that second line right there. Make sense? Good. We don't really have to worry about what the character set is, or that line, don't worry about that. This one just says that the width of the page should be the width of whatever device it's running on by default. Again, doesn't really matter that much to us at this point. What does matter is the title of the page. So where does the page title appear when you view it in a browser? On the tab. Yes, very good. So, notable kittens of history. Sure. The head contains information which is not meant to be displayed in the web page. You'll note. Sorry? Yes. So you see how we have the head element and the body element?
Yeah.
The head element contains information not meant to be displayed in the page itself, right? The title is not considered to be part of the page, right? It's put into the tab. The tab is not part of the page. You'll notice that these three tags say meta, so these are metadata. You guys know what the term meta means? Yeah, right. So, useful then to define meta, not metaphor, not a meta. Referring to itself or the conventions of its genre, that's another creative word. Self-referential. So it's self-referential data. It's data pertaining to the data, right? That's what metadata means. Also, occasionally jokes. Meta humor is a joke about the fact you're making a joke. Do you get it? I'm so meta, even this acronym. Yeah, the acronym is I'm so meta, even this acronym is meta, right? The acronym, that's a meta joke, that's meta humor, but anyway. So anyway, that's what metadata is. It's just data which is attached to the data to describe or give you information about the data. So, like for example, files keep metadata, like what their last modified date was. That's metadata in the file system. Anyway, so the body is where you put the actual contents of your web page. So, for example, I'm making a web page about notable kittens of history. It's normal to start a web page off with a header, right? We have a number of different headings, H1 through H6, each of them at various sizes. It's not really useful to use anything smaller than an H4 because then it gets smaller than the paragraph text, which is stupid. So let's make this an H2 heading. H2. Notable kittens of history. H3. Mittens. Kitten of Napoleon Bonaparte. H3 socks, kitten of Genghis Khan, and H3 Mr. Fuzzy, kitten of Julius Caesar. So there we go. So it's very, very important when doing HTML to include both the start and the end tag. Technically speaking, due to old versions of HTML, HTML will do a certain amount of filling in the blanks with respect to ending things like headings and paragraphs. So for example, if I said paragraph, mittens, notorious to the English and Spanish, was key to Napoleon's military strategy. Not end the tag. Despite constantly being embroiled in scandal, Napoleon was never the less loyal to his good friend. You'll notice that should start rendering this. So if you right-click on the file in the Explorer, you can reveal in File Explorer, which is, of course, the system default Explorer. If you double-click on this, you can choose to open it in a web browser, and there you have it, our notable Kittens of History webpage. You'll notice that these paragraphs do not have end tags, and yet in the document as rendered, they are in different paragraphs. The browser is inserting the end paragraph tags automatically, but recent developments in the way the internet is done consider this extremely poor form. You should always, always, always include your ending tags. As a matter of fact, there is a thing called the W3 Schools HTML validator. Also known as the markup validation service. This is a service which will tell you if your web page is junk, which is kind of useful. You were probably like, wow, man, no compiler errors to worry about. This is great. Well, here's where you get your compiler errors from. Sorry to say. So you can upload either by just uploading the file, or you can enter the text into this window, and it will tell you how well you are programming, basically. So if I drag and drop my chosen file, click check, document checking completed, no errors or warnings to show. Therefore, my Kittens website is perfectly valid and compliant HTML. This is also checking for compliance with the latest standards. However, if I reintroduce that little error that I had before, which nevertheless does display properly, save that up, and upload that version, and check it. Oh, come on. Did I save it? Does it not complain about that? Interesting. Let's try it one more time. And then I'll make a more obvious error. Check. No, I guess it doesn't complain about ending, not ending paragraphs. What it does complain about not ending is divs. So let's say I'm putting this inside of a div. But I just kind of forget to put the ending div, right? There we go. End tag for body scene, but there were unclosed elements. Unclosed element div. It will go through, pick apart the structure of your HTML, tell you if there are any problems with it. I highly recommend for any work that you submit to me for evaluation in this course, if you, check it first, please. Make sure that it's valid HTML, because this is the tool I'm going to be using to check to see if it's valid HTML. Right? Because, while it's possible for me to sit there and pick through looking for each of your non-compliances with the standard, there are tools for that, So there you go. So anyway, so far so good? So let's talk a little bit more about web forms.
Sorry, web forms?
Yes. the form elements so nope, I'm going to do links first. Links are more important at the moment. So, you've all seen links on websites. This is how they work. First thing you need is two websites, or two web pages, right? So let's make a second one. Let's call this gallery.html. Insert our default there. Gallery of kittens. 3 under construction. So I'm not actually going to make the web page. Right? Just a basic HTML page. If we view this page, it's got
Under construction.
under construction. So, let's say we want our index page to link to our new page. We create a link element. Paragraph. For more pictures of kittens, check out our gallery. Where gallery, the word gallery, is intended to be a link. Now, for whatever reason, the tag name for links is A. A means link. Not link, the word link, not L for link. For whatever reason, it's A. But if that's all you give it, there's nothing linked to. In the same way that when we created an image, we have to tell the image what it is that we are linking to, or what image we're including, we also have to specify that for a link. So, the tag name is not source, it is href. Href stands for hypertext reference. We then provide the name of the file that we wish to link to. It is preferred that you use relative file addressing and not absolute file addressing. The intention when you're making a web page is that eventually this is going on a server somewhere. What you want to be able to do is copy and paste this folder to a server and still have it work. Therefore, all of your references should be relative to the current working directory. That's a complicated way of saying type just the name of the file you wish to link to. For example, gallery.html. You can see we now have our color and our underline. And clicking on it, we are brought to our gallery page. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
Now, let's complicate it just a little bit further. Let's imagine that the page you want to link to is inside of a subfolder. So let's say data, and inside the data folder you have an HTML file called data.html. To link to this file, let's just give it something. Here's some data. this file, a h ref is equal to data.html, pardon me. If we create it like this, it's incorrect because we're not taking into account the subfolder. But let's see what happens anyways. We get one of these. Our file could not be accessed. We are looking for data inside of the class 2 directory. You can see the directory structure at the top. It's actually in a subfolder called data. So if you modify this to data/data.html, then you get the correct link. Does that make sense?
Can you explain it from the beginning?
Sure.
For that? When you created the data file?
Yeah. So in terms of the structure, right? I have a folder, right? This folder contains index.html. It also contains another folder called data and data.html. Files are usually done as little pieces of paper, right? So here, if I'm referencing data.html,
You're basically referencing to the first one.
you're referencing to the first folder. You're looking for data.html here. But this file doesn't exist. So you get a file doesn't exist error. So if you want to get this one, you have to
Reference this first, and then the other one. Okay.
precisely. So and the way that you separate file folders from themselves and files is using slashes. So data/HTML, data.html, that creates a link that works. Whereas if you don't include that, you're looking for it in the wrong place. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Good. Any other questions? Okay. So,
Can you go to the data.html?
Sure.
Just to show me
it's very, very simple.
this part.
Yeah. So now I would like to complicate things slightly further. This is setting us up for CSS, and it's setting us up for JavaScript. As things stand, we're doing okay, but what we don't have is a way to pick out one specific element of this HTML page so that we can work with just that, right? You probably saw me do like some quick, in the last class I did a couple of quick CSS examples where I made a heading look like so, or I gave something a background color, right? You can modify everything of a particular element type that way. But to modify, for example, just this heading is impossible without giving it some distinguishing feature that sets it apart from all of the other H3 headings, right? To that end, we have two additional attributes. We have ID and class. So, to set an ID, you simply say ID is equal to, and then pick a name. This is a little bit like picking a variable name. For example, my head. We can also assign things to classes. Class, green text. So, the difference, the big difference between an ID and a class, many elements may be in one class, but IDs must be unique. Right? That makes sense. An identifier is something you're identifying some one thing with. Yeah. You can imagine this even being a serial number or a student number, as it were. But a class, I hope you guys didn't like have a moment of panic that we were getting to object-oriented again. We're not talking about classes in that sense. It's more like we are adding this to a set of things, right? We are adding this to a set of classes, like this thing is included in a set of classes, or this element is included in a set of elements called green text. Now, it is possible to include an element in more than one class. For example, import. So this one it has green text. Well, we would write CSS to give it green text, right? But it's in class green text and class important. Whatever the styling properties for important are, those will be added in addition to whatever styling properties are given by green text, eventually when we write some CSS. For now, we can do as much of that as we want. It doesn't actually affect how the page renders. This you can also think of as metadata, right? Does this make sense? This is how we identify particular elements out of a file for applying style properties to. It will eventually also be how we pick particular elements out of an HTML file to be modified by JavaScript. So there you go. IDs and classes. We will see a lot more of them, but we needed to introduce them. Make sense? Good. So, any questions? Clear as day, shining through a crystal window. Hopefully. So, I'm not sure what we're going to have time for working examples. So I will show you, we'll go through the W3 Schools page on form elements so that you can get a flavor for what types are available and what the code looks like. So, Inputs in a form may have one of several different types. The type attribute is where you select whether it's a text box or a checkbox or a button or a submit button or what have you. In this case, we've got text, radio, checkbox, submit, and button. Now, you may be saying to yourself, but Mr. Professor, sir, submit is a button. Why is it not button of type button? Because it is clearly a button. Well, dear student, the submit button has a particular special role inside of the form element. Most of the time, actually, you won't use a button inside of a form. You can actually just add these inputs to your HTML page without putting them in a form. I can just, drop in input type equals button. Click me. I think that'll work. Either that or you just use button. Let's see. Nope. Yeah. Now you have to say value, I think. Value is the text. There we go. So it's a button, it's not doing anything, right? We'll use lots of these once we get into JavaScript, because basically, you know how in Windows forms, you would take something like this and you would create a click event for it, and then you would have some code in that click event? It works almost precisely in the same manner in JavaScript. We call them event listeners in JavaScript rather than event handlers, but handlers and listeners are basically the same thing. So we're going to hook those up to code eventually, but you can just kind of drop them in. Good. So in addition to being able to add text boxes, we can also add text to the text box to tell us what the text box is supposed to have in it, right? These take the form of labels. So when you create a label, you have the for attribute specifying the ID of the input that it's supposed to apply to. Not the name, but the ID. You'll see in this case, names and IDs are identical, but that's not a requirement. It's not a requirement, but it might be, a reasonable approximation. So, when you render this code, the label first name applies itself to the button that it corresponds to. Now, a fun thing about this is that it does it somewhat intelligently. Right? It does it in the order given, right? So it's not going to be moving things around to please you. Another thing another formatting thing which we haven't discussed yet, we haven't discussed it because it's kind of discouraged, is this guy right here, BR. BR stands for break line. HTML files gobble white space. For example, let's say that I wanted a line break after this comma, right? If I press enter, I get it in the HTML file, but once that file is rendered, you'll see that no change has occurred. That comma does not have a new line after it. Again, this is because the spacing on an HTML file is not preserved when rendered. If you want a new line in, you have to put something that says new line in, right? That is the BR break tag. Or, there you go. We now have the break where we want it. Use of the break tab is reasonably strongly discouraged. There are a number of correct applications of it, but the tendency of the beginning user of HTML is to overuse the bloody thing. In particular, to do things like insert a break when what you actually meant was you want to start a new paragraph, right? Again, in the internet, we are trying to get away from this type of thinking. The HTML page should contain what is to be said and not how it should be displayed, right? You should not really be needing to make decisions about individual line breaks like this unless you're doing something where that's absolutely necessary and you don't have appropriate tags to describe what you're doing. One example of that is poetry, right? When you're writing a poem in HTML, obviously the new lines are a part of the poem, right? If you didn't include the breaks, it would all be run together on one line, thus ruining the look of the poetry, etc. So in cases like that, you use the break tag, right? But most of the time, you don't need it, and you probably shouldn't use it, right?
So if we are not supposed to use it, so what should we do if we want to break the line or use it in a different paragraph?
If you're starting a new paragraph,
Oh.
make a new paragraph.
Oh, you got it. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, that's okay.
I mean, it makes sense logically, right? If you're starting a new paragraph in the text, start a new paragraph in the tags, right?
Yeah, got it.
Yeah, good. It comes down to a maintainability thing too. I'm not gonna go through and actually make this, but here's an example. Let's say that you had a bulleted list of words, right? We can use, what's the tag for an unordered list?
Structure.
What's that? The opening tag is UL for unordered list. Each one of these is list item. You don't actually have to draw the bullets in your HTML. But another way you could do this is you could include an image of a bullet, right? A small one in front of, a paragraph tag, which is then ended by a break, right? To do the same thing. And it might even look good when you're done. But it's not a list. This is using HTML to try to make something look the way you want it to. This is using HTML to describe what things in the document are. Using this style, you can use CSS to style this very easily, know what you're doing, apply consistent styling across all such structures very nice, very pretty. Programming goes this way. This is the way we program, right? Working with something like this in CSS is much more difficult, particularly if these two have been used alternatingly in different, like, if both of these exist in the same file and you're trying to account for both of them, it gets increasingly, you're basically just making work for yourself. This is less work for you in the long run. This is more work for you, not even in the long run. In the short term, this is way more work, right? This is just more work, don't do it this way.
Yep.
So anyway, so that's the idea. Does that make sense? Let me just quickly radio buttons. Very quickly, the actual text of a radio button is in the label, but you also have a checked property, which you can set one of them to be checked by default. So checked equals true, right? So if you want, like, that doesn't impede the user's ability to modify it, right? But if you want to set one of those as being the initial default checked one, you can use the checked tag. You can also do this with checkboxes, but obviously with radio boxes, one thing is checked at a time. With checkboxes, you can have as many things checked at a time as you want, right? In JavaScript, once we get to JavaScript, looking for checked being true is how we tell which one of these is currently checked so that we can then run code. Does that make sense? Good.
My question, what is name? What should we use?
Here?
Yes.
So, you remember when we were talking about like packet types and post versus get last class, and how this data will be sent off to the server at some point? Well, you'll notice each one of these radio boxes has the same name. That means that all three of those radio boxes are in the same radio box set. It groups them, right? So that's how the browser knows this one, that one, or that one, because it's selecting between ones with the same name. That's how you can have multiple sets of radio boxes on the same page. They have different names. Also, when this information gets sent back to the server, that's the name, and that will be the value sent. So what the server will see in this state, if we submit the form, is it will include data, it'll include fave underscore language, value CSS. That's what the server will receive. Does that make sense? Cool. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time today.
Professor,
And,
you will post this, right, on the...
yeah, I'll post it.
Okay.
Although I'd appreciate if somebody checked it outside to see if somebody's trying to get in.
I don't think so. Someone is
Sometimes they're very polite and stay out of sight. No?
This class is usually empty. Usually. Oh.
It's also the first week, and people, like, some classes don't even start till the third week or something. Like, if you look at, yeah, like certain, not necessarily like day school courses, but like continuing education courses which get booked in, they don't start this week, so, yeah. What's today? 4. I suppose I got it on here.
This thing here. And then I'll join you guys. Box is 8008, right?
There you go. All right. See you next week, everyone.